Thank you for joining us today, guys. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
World War I was one of the most significant military activities in history. It was a transition from Victoria era fighting to industrial age fighting.
The 1914 Christmas Truce, I'll tell you, when I was a kid, I saw a documentary on Channel 11, WTTW Chicago, and it was a documentary on the Christmas Truce. And as a small kid, I was completely amazed by it. I just thought it was the neatest thing that in this horrible, awful war that everybody talked about. My great-grandfather, who was still alive at the time, used to tell me stories about the Great War. And he would tell me that, it was awful. But it was like, well, wait a minute. In 1914, they all put their guns down. They got out in the middle of the field. They had a truce. They exchanged Christmas gifts and stuff. He said, yeah.
Both sides had the most modern weapons at the time. They had machine guns that could fire 500 rounds a minute. They had, at the time, what would be considered modern bolt-action rifles that could hold 5, 7, or 10 rounds, depending upon which army and make it was. And they had the field artillery that accompanied the infantry that now could fire 20 rounds a minute.
But the story always sort of kind of intrigued me. It's like, we talk about the Christmas spirit and how it means something. And I got to tell you that story has always stuck with me. That's one of the reasons we put this event together, is to kind of share that.
Both sides had comparable weapons. They thought that the enthusiasm of their troops and the conflict would overcome those weapons and then with their cavalry encircling the opposition would win the battle.
East side of the field, or where the Allies are, Brits and French dug in. And those are pretty typical of the 1914 trenches. They were very shallow. When we get done talking today, you guys are welcome to filter through the trenches, and you can take a look at the trenches on the other side. Those are typical more of what you would have seen earlier in the war. This is more typical what you would have seen in 1917, 1918, where by that time they had dug down. These are shallow trenches. Most of the German trenches would have been about 10 to 15 feet deep, and they would have actually had reinforced concrete. The bunkers, where you see the bunks and people living, you'll see display stuff inside the bunkers. Usually that stuff would be about 10 to 15 feet underground, so if they got artillery strikes, they wouldn't get completely obliterated. When World War I started in 1914, the German plan was to subdue France like they did in the 1870s by sending troops. The original plan was to send troops through Holland and then down in Belgium and into France, so they could come around
around Paris and then trap the French troops that are along the border with Germany. Their plan was to do that in 2 weeks, at which time they thought they could defeat the French with their forces and then transfer their troops to the Eastern Front to defeat the Russians.
To give you guys background, there's a massive arms race in the late 19th century, which I had mentioned earlier. And the European countries developed more and more sophisticated implements of war to protect their territorial claims and enforce their policies by force if necessary. So the English Empire, British Empire, was, the sun never set because the sun was always rising or setting somewhere on the British Empire throughout the world. The French also had colonies everywhere, and the Belgians had colonies in Africa. And it was the age of imperialism, where everybody was trying to get their place in the sun, as the Germans called it. The Germans wanted their place in the sun. They had colonies in China, down in the Pacific, and also down in Africa as well.
Brand new target. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, so sorry. He goes, no. So that's fucking cool. I guess he's been showing all his friends.
They win.
We're going to do the story of the Christmas Truce. I appreciate you guys coming out on this cold and windy day. This kind of gives you a feeling. If you can imagine 100 years ago sleeping out in exactly like this weather, because the weather in France, because of the Atlantic, tends to be a little bit warmer than it is here in the heartlands of the United States. So in December 1914, the weather you have today is almost identical to what they described in the weeks leading up to Christmas, where it was sleet mixed with snow, mixed with occasionally snow that would stick, that it would melt off the next day. But this is the weather that they had is right now. If you can imagine, 1914, everybody got really excited. They was like, we're going to go kick those butts of all the other guys. We're going to kill all the Germans. We're going to win this war. And there's a whole arms race in Victorian Europe that was leading up to this for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, basically from the 1860s on, from the Crimean War. That there's tension building up like a steam pot. And when it blew up, everybody said, we're going to march and we're going to go show those Germans a thing or two. The Germans like, we're going to go show those Brits a thing or two, and the French a thing or two. And everybody found out that they weren't right. And I'll go into the detail on that in a minute. And they bogged down, and they were in this weather.
Keep everybody warm. I should have brought my 7 more. I can make tea.
They considered the Russians more of a threat to them because of their numbers. They thought it would take the Russians 8 weeks to mobilize, and in reality, the Russians were able to mobilize in 4 weeks. They attacked then Eastern Prussia, which really upset the timetable for the Germans. They didn't intend to have a two-front war. They thought they could finish the one. Instead of a two-front war, it would be 2 consecutive wars. Defeat the French in time, quickly, and then attack the Russians and defeat them. And of course, as history has shown, that did not happen.
Interesting, in my collection of paraphernalia from World War I have a collection of 5 or 6 wedding rings that all have iron crosses on them, and they say for Deutschland, Deutsch über alles, and all that. And some of them say Gilt for Eisen, gold for iron. And if you turn the ring inside, you look at it, it says patented 1914, St. Louis, Missouri. Those were rings that were turned, they would turn in their gold wedding rings, wedding bands, melt them down to support the war effort in Germany, because there's so many German farmers from this area in the Midwest, and we're a neutral country, so there's no problems. Some of the recent immigrants who came here, they even sent their German farmer sons, or recent immigrants that still had reserve status in Germany, they went back to Germany to go fight for Germany, because America was a neutral, so it wasn't a big deal at the time. That all changed in 1917, of course, after the sinking of the Lusitania.
Conflict bogged down, then they went to the trench system. The Germans pulled back a little bit further north,
right down to
and
the
they took
booth.
all the ideal ground to develop their trenches. The trench lines were dictated by natural George's speech is so exciting.
It is. I always learn stuff.
But so this arms race was mainly small arms, I mean rifles, and in our collections we could show you 20 different varieties of weapons that, you know, I think from maybe 1800 to 1860 most countries replaced their weapons once, from flintlocks to cap and ball. A lot of times they just converted the rifles, but by 1860 to 1900 most European countries had replaced their standard service rifle at least 3 to 4 times. By 1914, it might have been 5 times because they were in such a race to try to keep up with the Joneses. And but this also included machine guns, modern artillery, quick-fire artillery, airplanes that were developed right after the turn of the century. You also had submarines, modern guns and ammunition, smokeless powder, high-velocity ammunition, and the Europeans had never really fought a war with these weapons against each other. So everybody thought, we got the best of the best, we're going to go against these guys, it's going to be a bloodbath for the other side.
Grab my bow again. Yeah, I proceed to do, you know, normal like infantry. Boom, boom, boom. Pull it back 5 rounds like that. Center mass, his girlfriend starts laughing. Oh, pissy.
I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do with my Mosin.
But
I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do with my Mosin.
what's wrong with
1944, it's a sniper variant.
Ooh.
And I...
The story of 1914, there were rapid advances. The Germans, for those who don't know what happened in World War I, there is a Austro-Hungarian Empire. They owned what is now today part of Yugoslavia. There's a lot of people there that are not German and they're not Austrian, or they're not Hungarian. So the Austro-Hungarians occupied that area, and they had nationalists that were there that were not happy about the Austro-Hungarians being there. Some of them went and they assassinated the Archduke, who was next in line to become the king of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarians, they kind of got mad. And they said, well, who did this? And they found out that it was a bunch of Serbian, what they were phrased as terrorists. Other people might refer to them as freedom fighters. But they fled into Serbia, which is an independent country at the time, very tiny. And they said, well, you need to turn over the terrorists. Well, we're not going to do that. Yeah. So what happened is the Austro-Hungarians said, well, if you don't turn them over, we're going to invade your country. And they said, bring it on. And the reason they said that is because they had a secret treaty with the Russians. And the Russians, which are also an Eastern Orthodox power or country, they said, don't worry, little buddy, we're going to help you out. We're there to help you. So as soon as the Austro-Hungarians mobilized, the Russians said, okay, we're mobilizing, we're declaring war in Austria-Hungary. Like, oh, okay, well, we've been marching quick because the Russians are coming.
Artist. And you put enough rounds through it,
Yeah.
the shell gets stuck.
Yeah, you'll see it start
So I gotta sand them off before I use the rest of them. Yeah, I gotta get stuck in there. I got a hole. I have to take a hammer to get the bolt open. And then it pulled through the bottom. And then I had to take the rod and stick it down there and tap with a hammer and pop it out. I was like, Jesus Christ.
Another one of those
Was
things.
in the Heizung? What's in the Heizung?
What the Russians didn't know is that the Austro-Hungarians had a secret treaty with the Germans. And the Germans had a treaty, if you ever get attacked by Russia, we'll join your side. Okay, so the Germans mobilized because that was their treaty obligation. Well, the French had a treaty obligation with the Russians that if they ever got attacked by the Germans, that the French would mobilize. So I was like, okay, well, the French were like, we don't really want to go against the Germans again, but, you know, let's have at it. And then you had neutral Belgium. And the Germans said, the Russians are archaic, their rail systems are shambles. It'll take them 4 or 5 months to mobilize. In that time, we could go invade France, knock France out of the war, and then we could go deal with Russia. So that's what they did. They came up with this plan where they're going to march through neutral Belgium, because all the French are sitting on the German border. So they just marched through Belgium, that was neutral, to go into northern France where they had no defenses. And when they invaded Belgium, going back to the Napoleonic War 100 years earlier, that was there's a treaty obligation that the British had at Waterloo that they said they would protect little tiny Belgium if they ever got attacked by some big nasty foreign power again. Well, then the Germans invaded, so the British were like, oh, Okay, so they organized, they sent their expeditionary force over, and they said, that's okay, we got better weapons and more discipline, we're going to kill all the Germans before they even make it to France, not a problem. So, the French stopped the German drive just outside of Paris. The British get their butts handed to them really in Belgium, but they continue fighting, and they eventually help with the French to stall them again about 70 miles outside of Paris. The fighting stabilized on both sides. Both sides take mass casualties in 1914. And when things kind of grind to a halt, what happens is that neither side really has an advantage, so they start digging in. First is foxholes, then they start connecting them, then they start trenches. They end up with the trenches like you see over there by October, November of 1914. By December 1914, a lot of them are starting to look more like this, especially on the German side. Keep in mind, the Germans took all of Belgium, and they took half of northern France. So the Germans are sitting pretty, and they're kind of in a good position. The French capital can hear the artillery fire off in the distance, and they know that there's an issue there. So you got to look at the French and think, back in 1870-71, they fought the Franco-Prussian War. And for those who aren't that well versed in European history, the French and Germans have been fighting over territory for centuries, but that was one of the most recent flare-ups in the late 1800s. And the Franco-Prussian War, the French stood behind defenses. They had fortified cities with big city walls and castles and stuff that was left over from the medieval period and reinforced all the way up until the 1800s. And they basically went into these fortress cities. The Germans just surrounded them and laid siege to them, and everybody starved. And they said, you know what, and the make a long story short, the French lost, and they said, you know what, we're not sitting behind defenses again. Next time we fight the Germans, our entire doctrine is going to change to where we are going to attack, 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 attack. And when you see the French come out, you can see how off in the distance, they're not hard to see. The guys with the funny red hats, and when they stand up, you'll see their bright red pants, their pantalon rouge. The pantalon rouge seems like the dumbest thing in the entire world. Why the heck would you wear a bunch of red pants in the middle of a battlefield? And it really dates back to the Napoleonic War before, because as a commander, you didn't have telephones, you didn't have radios, so you had to be able to look off through like a telescope or a pair of binoculars, and you can see all these guys running around brightly colored uniforms like, oh, those are my guys. Tell you what, take a horse dispatch rider, go tell them to go to the right flank, because I can see what's going on from the top of this hill a bit better than they can. Or you know what, I think I can see other guys massing over here. They should probably pull back to the other hill so they could defend that. So it's a uniform piece that dates back to prior to Napoleon, but the Pantalon Rouge was a national emblem in France. And everybody said, we should really update our uniforms to something modern. And they said, no, this is a national emblem, we're not doing it. Okay. So, in their Pantalon Rouge, these guys, the French had a great idea. They said, well, since the Germans want to declare war on us, we're going to invade Germany. We're going to take back Alsace-Lorraine, which they took. Those provinces were taken from us in 1870-71. And when we do that, we're going to use our attack, attack, attack doctrine. We're not going to defend, and we're just going to push forward. And they had what they call their oula, their spirit, their fighting force. And they're going to charge across the field. That's fighting force is what's going to carry them to kill all of the Germans. But they never thought about machine guns before. And the French took over 1 million casualties in the first 3 months of fighting, just attacking, attacking, attacking. And they didn't make any headway. And the Germans expected them to do that, and they basically set up all their defenses around that. So the French were back licking their wounds at this point. So the trenches start to be dug. By December of 1914, there's 700 miles of trenches from Switzerland to the English Channel. It's like digging trenches from here to Pennsylvania, probably central Pennsylvania. And the British and the French were really licking their wounds and just trying to stay alive at this point in time of the war. So depression and thoughts of home really crept in December as they rolled towards Christmas Eve in 1914. In the week of Christmas, really the snow started dusting northern France a lot like it did this morning, and it's melted off since then, often mixed with cold rain. And it was still cold enough to where the bodies out in the field didn't completely, they froze, but they weren't quite decomposing just yet. But some of it was too unsafe to go out into the field to retrieve the dead bodies. And what precipitated the Christmas Truce was really the fact that they had bodies that they wanted to retrieve with their comrades, and it's Christmas time, and they thought, you know what, maybe we could come up with some better system. And what they did is they came up with the idea for a truce to remove these bodies. So the Germans, like I said, they were doing pretty well, and the centerpiece of their tradition is the Christmas tree. And the Germans took their Tannenbaum or their Weihnachtsbaum, and they would suspended supplies of ammunition so they could send up hundreds of thousands of Christmas trees so the Germans could celebrate Christmas. And they also sent out whole trainloads of gift packages and special Christmas rations, alcohol for the frontline troops, and many of them were kind of alarmed that their ammunition supplies were being withheld so they could get Christmas trees and rations of schnapps. So they thought that was absolutely completely ludicrous, because they knew the British and French were doing the same thing, and they're trying to get ammunition up to the front because they're going to attack it any day. And the Germans were scared about that. They were not happy about the Christmas trees. Sorry, I have to toggle a couple things here. So the Germans wanted to share their Christmas cheer, though, and they had all these stupid Christmas trees. So what they did is sometimes they would put one of those Christmas trees out on the parapet so the other side could see it, just to share a little Christmas spirit. Now the tree went up, but usually they do this at night. You can't light a cigarette at night. You can't have a campfire. You'd be in the cold, and you would just have to deal with it, because if you had a campfire, that's all of a sudden a zero wind spot for artillery to come in on your position. So what the Germans did, though, is they said they were feeling a little emboldened, like, we're going to share Christmas spirit. They would light all the candles, and they put that out in the middle of the night in a completely black field. And you can imagine everybody's like, what the hell are they doing? They're absolutely insane. And it turns out that the other side generally didn't return fire because they're just kind of in shock and amazed. And often what happened is that you'd have Germans, because they had so many Christmas trees, they put a whole bunch up. So they would put Christmas trees all up along their line. It'd be a lot more impressive at night if you had the candles on there, because then all of a sudden you'd be able to see a whole line of, like, for that battalion or that company with like 50 or 100 Christmas trees set up with candles on it. And everybody's like, these guys are insane. But they didn't shoot them because it's Christmas time, right? And it sounds like something out of a Monty Python black comedy sketch, but this is what happened, and most often at night, as I had mentioned. So the Christmas tree is a solid German tradition. If you go and you look at postcards that we've collected from World War I, you'll find that almost every postcard, you'll see some of these when you get into the trench, actually have Christmas trees in them, and almost every single German postcard. When you look at the British postcards, you look at the French postcards, it's usually sprigs of holly or it's churches. It's more of a religious holiday, and Christmas trees generally do not play a central role. You see more of a religious motif on it. But the Germans like their Christmas trees so much that they even created their own song about it, about O Tannenbaum. And the Germans would often serenade the other side, just like they did there. But you can imagine a night with these glowing Christmas trees, and then these guys start singing. You know, at first the Allies are sort of incredulous that they're thumbing their nose at it. It's like, maybe they're just trying to share some Christmas spirit. So they thought about that. And often what they would do is they would have responses from across the other side of the field with songs. Sometimes you get some of the lowbrow types from the British underclasses that were serving in the British Army. They'd have lyrics and things like that they would sing that might not be appropriate for most audiences, but they were to nice Christmas music. Other times they would sing songs that they were very familiar with. So Silent Night, which is a song that actually developed in the 1840s in Austria. It was originally sung in German, rapidly spread to become one of the most famous Christmas songs of all, because the church organ broke and they were trying to figure out how they could still celebrate Christmas. So they came up with the song on the fly just before the Christmas service, and that's what everybody sang. And but it was sung very frequently, and everybody knew it in French, in German, and in English. So they would exchange those songs back and forth. So you heard somebody yell something from the other trench, and what was not as well known today, because it was 100 years ago, is that the Germans were looking for economic opportunities. There's a reason why we have so many German immigrants in this country from the 1870s through the early 1920s, is because a lot of them were trying to look for new opportunities. Yeah, but they did that a lot closer to home. A lot of these guys actually went to England, and they worked as common jobs as waiters and taxi drivers. So a lot of times they would try to sing nice songs to serenade the French or the British, or the Brits would yell, "Yeah, why don't you stick your heads up over the trench so I can take your order, waiter?" Or, "Yeah, I need a taxi back to Piccadilly, you bloody bastards." Or, and the Germans would often reply, "We would, but you do not tip very well, you cheap Englander." They would yell things back and forth over the trenches, because this is about the average distance between the frontline trenches. It was about 100 yards, 150 yards. The comparison today might be the stereotype of the Polish cleaning ladies or Mexican gardeners or busboys, and for this reason a lot of the Germans spoke perfect English because they lived in England before the war. When 1914 broke out, remember, they were helping Austria, so when their units got mobilized, a lot of these guys went back to Germany to go join their units before England even joined the war. So the Germans often would put up signs, or they would yell, "You no shoot, we no shoot, Englander. Merry Christmas," for the 353rd Prussian Infantry Regiment. The "you no shoot, we no shoot" message was translated roughly in French and English and German all along the lines by a lot of the local units during the weeks leading into Christmas. And many times this message was written on canvas tarps or on shelter halves, and or on boards from farmhouses and that had been destroyed. And they would be able to put them up over the trench so the enemy can read them. So in addition to the friendly insults and Christmas carols, there's a common interest in the peace that was inspired by Christmas. And what sparked the spontaneous Christmas truce in 1914 was just that. It wasn't organized, it wasn't planned, it wasn't observed in all sections. There's still sections where they still shot each other. But not every unit observed it either. Sometimes there's accounts to where the units would be sitting here and they'd be looking maybe half mile down the line where you could kind of see the parking lot down there. And they'd see these Christmas trees grow up, and then the next day you'd see all these guys get out of the trench and play a soccer game, and these guys are sitting at the other end ready to shoot the guys across from them because these guys didn't seem so friendly. And they're just like, what are they doing? And that was in their company reports that went back to the general headquarters. But often what happened is that they would actually try to organize these local truces, started by a local lieutenant or a captain who just happened to be in the front line, sometimes an NCO. So the German commander would generally fly a white flag, a service shirt, a towel, anything that was white to kind of show that they were coming out under a flag of truce. And they don't want to get shot, but again, it's Christmas time. These guys are singing carols to us last night, and they put up a bunch of Christmas trees, made themselves a target. Maybe they're serious. The Germans had more ground, and more gumption to get out of the trench because they were winning the war. So the other side was like, we're going to kill all these guys, and it's a desperate battle. For the Germans, they're like, we're sitting pretty. We're occupying a third of France. They felt like they were in a pretty good position. So in this case, these guys are trying to wave over the British commander, who's going to come over and hesitantly meet them because he's not quite sure if this is a ruse or not. And as I mentioned earlier, they wanted to get their comrades off the field. So what they did is they would broker these local peace to clear the bodies off the field. And often when they met on the field, a lot of times the officers that were a little bit better educated would actually speak German as well. And often the German officers would speak English or they would speak French because those are the two main languages that they were taught in school. Or in some cases they actually worked as migrant workers in those countries. But when they get together with the commander, they would follow standard military protocol with saluting, maybe shaking hands, and then they would try to talk about the respective sides, and they would broker a short-term peace to say, well, today we're not going to shoot you, you don't shoot us, we're going to go get our dead. Is that okay? So they'll clear their bodies off, and they'll send their dead back for a proper burial. The personal effects will go to the families where it should. And being Christmas time, a lot of these guys kind of like this. They said, well, maybe we could extend this out. So they would negotiate often and say, tell you what, we're not going to tell our superior officers this, but if you guys don't shoot us, we won't shoot you through New Year's. How about that? Like, that's a great idea. So when they went back and they told their troops about this, they said, well, that's great. That means that we could go sit on the parapet. We could have fire tonight so they don't shoot artillery at us. Like, yeah, maybe. They sang more songs back and forth, things like that. But when the deads were cleared, there's also, in that agreeing to meet on no man's land, both sides are really interested in the other guys, because maybe these guys aren't the nasty demons that everybody makes them out to be, because they seem to be just as cold as we are. So somebody got the idea to break out soccer balls, because one of the Christmas presents that was sent to the front lines on the British and the German sides were soccer balls. So I don't know what we're going to do with these exactly, but they found a use for them. So in addition to cleaning out these bodies, some of these guys started coming out of the trenches, and they said, you know what, maybe this isn't so bad. At first it was the officers and the NCOs, but then the enlisted guys started coming out too, because they're all really curious about what the other side has going on. And both sides, you read the newspapers, oh, we're winning the war and all this patriotic jargon. These guys are in the trenches. They're like in sub-zero temperatures in some cases, sleeping out with no fire, only one blanket. Weather that we're experiencing right now, but they didn't do it just for an hour or two. These guys are out there for weeks on end, and they're pretty miserable. It didn't matter what side or what army you're in, everybody's miserable in this weather, but they had to hold the line. So all of a sudden you see these guys starting to exchange presents and things like that. And one of the things that was interesting was that they would exchange cigarettes, cigars, food items are a big thing, and a lot of guys wanted to exchange tunic buttons. They tear the extra buttons off their sleeves and stuff like that and trade them out with the British, so they'd have a war souvenir. They exchanged a lot of postcards from home. They'd exchange newspapers so they could read what the other side was saying, books, photographs, personal effects, and they realized that maybe these guys aren't so bad. The Germans, as I said, they had their supplies of ammunition stopped for a couple weeks so they could bring up schnapps and sausages and cheese, and the German breweries flooded the trains with like barrels and barrels and barrels and barrels, like whole train loads full of beer, and they'd have cases of mugs. So when you go through the German trenches, you'll see ceramic mugs. Those are actually supplied by the breweries with beer for free for Christmas in 1914. And this is before rationing started too on all the sides, so they're pretty flush all around. Here they are getting some pictures with the one officer as a camera. And the British, it should be noted, they sent the typical Christmas plum pudding, and here's an example of a plum pudding from the Hearty Christmas Greetings from the City of London Territorial Association from 1914. This is a reproduction of a pudding tin from the Imperial War Museum. They thought that every British soldier should have a pudding, his own personal tin, because that's what you got when you're in the home front for Christmas. So they produced like, I don't know, 50 million of these stupid things, and they sent trainloads and trainloads and trainloads. And the British were like, oh my God, that's crazy. It's like, you guys are stopping our trainloads of ammunition because you guys are bringing up all these stupid Christmas puddings. And this is also a royal thing. This is Princess Mary who's on this tin. Yeah, this is the Princess Mary Christmas tin from 1914. This contains cigarettes, candies, a little bit of writing paper. For Indian troops that were serving, they would have Indian spices that they couldn't get with curries and things like that. But they had 4 or 5 different things in here for different types of troops. But they produced something like 2 million of these and sent them to the front line. So every soldier could get a personally signed Christmas card from the royal family. And everybody's like, well, that's great. We're getting puddings and we're getting these stupid brass tins with candy in them. And the Germans are getting all their ammunition set up to them, and they're going to invade us any minute. But they didn't realize that they're both in the same boat because the other side's getting Christmas trees and a bunch of worse beer. So it was interesting that they were flush with things. The French were also flush with tobacco, and they got these meerschaum pipes with a soldier's face on them. Those were huge trading fodder that everybody wanted to trade on the front lines. So there's quite a bit of trading.
Sommerzeit, dein auf dem Winter, wenn es
The plum puddings actually were so popular, or maybe unpopular with the troops, because after about 3 or 4 weeks of eating plum puddings every single meal out of these tins, when the Germans said, well, what are those? Like, oh, this is a delicacy in Britain. You're going to love these. So they would bring, I think they brought a case of them out, and they would trade them a whole case for like a bottle of schnapps or something like that. The Germans, they thought this was great. You know, the French would have tons of wine that was brought up for Christmas, so they would easily trade that stuff back and forth. So, also on the German side, the government supplied, you know, smoking pipes and tobacco and things like that. The Germans also had these societies where they would put together local community organizations, where a lot of the young ladies and that were left on the home front, they would try to develop care packages for the soldiers, and they called them loving parcels, where the German civilians would give them all kinds of presents from home to these. You're right. Test. Test. Can you hear me now? All right. We'll forgo that. I think the battery's going on it, because this is our last minute sort of thing. Can you guys hear me if I speak up a little bit? Yeah. All right. That'll be easier. I got 2 hands now. So, alcohol, as I mentioned, was in abundance with these guys. So, what do you do with a bunch of guys that are really cold out in the woods, and they're getting shot at, and they're miserable, and they're thinking of home, and they're thinking they're going to get killed the next day, and they're looking at all their frozen buddies on the field? Give them alcohol. So, schnapps on the German side, lots of beer too. Cognac on the French side, French wine. In the British, lots of beer, and rum. Rum was actually an official ration for the British. They actually had special bottles. Yeah. So it came in this big ginger-colored ceramic jug that was. It was marked SD, SRD. Yeah, I don't. It's some sort of a service command thing that it was official, so it could actually have alcohol in it. But everybody said the SRD stand there seldom reaches destination, because often they would get these things that would be half empty because the guys along the lines bringing it up and drinking, or they'd siphon it off in their canteens. But there's no shortage of alcohol. So 1914 was a party, man. At least in the sections where they observed the troops, and these massive numbers of gift parcels, again, before rationing in 1914. Everybody had stuff to trade. So in subsequent years, they did not have truces, partly because of rationing, and partly because there's a huge lockdown on the front lines to prevent this thing happening. Because they said, well, if they're getting along and they're playing soccer games with their enemies, what's to prevent the war from completely grinding to a halt? What if you have a big game and nobody shows up to play? So the higher commands wanted to put a kibosh to this sort of thing. So you see the soccer ball. Often these games are organized in no man's land. They'd set up barbed wire posts to use as goals, and they kick these things around. If they didn't have balls, some of the journals and newspaper articles at the time talk about how they used sandbags, and they used flour bags that they would pack with extra clothes and stuff like that to kick around the field as well. And some of the diaries, there's a French unit that noted that the Germans had a perfectly trained messenger dog that would run between the lines and shared messages in no man's land. And they would put backpacks in the dog, and the dog would bring schnapps and stuff and sausages to the French. And the French would send back cognac, and they would send brie cheese and stuff like that back to the Germans. And they were also able to send messages. So they'd say, there's an artillery bombardment scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow. Go to your reserve trench. We'll be a little bit slow in going out to the front. Just throw some sporadic fire, and we'll say it's too much. We'll pull back. So they would work out these sorts of things to where they didn't want their buddies that they just made friends with to get killed. But that's obviously not any good if you're trying to run a war, right? So they would also send warning messages saying, hey, our unit's rotating out. This happened a lot of times with the German units. They'd say, a lot of the Saxon units were really friendly to the Brits, and because they hated the Prussians. A lot of the German units, keep in mind, a lot of the German countries, you think of Bavaria, Saxony, the Black Forest, a lot of these places were actually their own countries up until 1871. Under the unification under Bismarck in Germany in 1870s, 1871, 1860s, a lot of these countries kind of resented the Prussians for being like the 100-pound, 500-pound gorilla, on scene and kind of running the show in Germany. And they would say, yeah, there's a Prussian unit rotating through. I wouldn't trust them. So while these arrangements for fraternization were seen as a positive, the upper echelons of command did not see it that way. Some of the officers in the front line they kind of turned a blind eye to it. Others attempted to stop the troops, but were ignored and found that they were unable to get their troops back into the trenches. It took stern warnings and threats from higher levels of command to force the troops to break off these relations with their counterparts opposing them. Often units were quickly rotated out of the line, and they quickly rotated a new unit in that was ready to kill Germans. Or vice versa on the German side. In some cases, officers in charge were court-martialed, or they were relieved of command and sent someplace else in the rear. And officers that were a little bit more motivated to fight the Germans were put in place. So these efforts led to a rapid dissolution of the Christmas Truce within days of Christmas, after Christmas. The longest-running local truces lasted no more than the first week of January 1950. There is a hope. The hope that there is for humanity is that even in the darkest hours, that there are some universal truths, such as the meaning of Christmas and the Christmas spirit. The basic idea of goodwill towards men, peace on earth, at Christmas created a grassroots ceasefire on a massive scale along the entire front line in 1914. No units, not all units participated, and not all the killing and shooting stopped, but large enough numbers of people stopped and put down their weapons to shake hands with their enemies. And they shared the same misery, and they shared the same issues with death caused by politics that they were started in a place that they didn't have any control over. The peace was temporary, but the question always remains, what would have happened if these troops just put their guns down and decided not to fight it? They refused to fight. If the truce had happened in 1916 or 17, that outcome might have been much different than in 1914, when there's still a lot of fighting spirit left, and everybody had hopes for a quick victory in the spring of 1915. By the end of the war, that wasn't so much the case. Only a couple million men had become casualties of the war in the first 5 months of World War I. The war would only end after a total of 38 million casualties mounted, and the Germans, Austrians, and Turks finally collapsed. The public no longer supported the war efforts, and the war was just not tenable, also leading to an overthrow, basically, of the German government in 1918. This included 17 million deaths, 20 million wounded, combined military and civilian casualties in World War I. And on the Russian side, it was astronomically higher than that. By comparison, to match the numbers of deaths in World War I, we would have to kill every man, woman, and child in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, including the entire population in city and metro areas of Chicago and Milwaukee, to come close to the casualties that they suffered in World War I. But for the moment on Christmas Day 1914, there was a glimmer of hope that Christmas spirit could conquer hate, even in one of the largest wars in human history. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We invite you guys to come down to the trench, give us a minute to reset, and you guys can come through, talk to the reenactors.
owner of MGM actually went down to Pelham, Tennessee. And there he got a buggy ride or walk, talked to Sergeant York, and found out the reason why Sergeant York kept saying no is because the fact that they were in a back, rural backwoods area, he didn't want the movie to show his community in a bad light. So he was afraid, they'd be making fun of him, showing his country hicks, whatever, the negativism of living in a very rural part of America. So he told him, hey, you've got total rights to it, a final word, and so he gave the okay.
It's usually like this number of reenactors-ish, right? In Illinois State Museum, down in Springfield. Amazing. It's so much fun. And it's small, so sometimes it's small. It's nice having the big ones.
Bundeswehrhelm.
And the rats were liberated on the battlefields because they would go out in the field.
Von meinen Großmutter, Aldi.
They'd come back and then they'd live in bunkers. And then there's also water and food and other stuff. So if you drank stuff out of your canteen cups and stuff like that, you had to hang everything up or put it in your bag and then hang your bag up because otherwise the rats would get it.
Were you dead in the field?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, I was just wondering about the mud.
No, I just find the mud and stick it on my face. There's all this mud around, and it's not on my face, but I can clean them.
Absolutely. I'm about to say.
You can't waste a good set of mud.
If it's not mud, you're covered in sweat to the point where you look like
Here.
This doesn't look like you're holding an English rifle.
It feels weird.
I know.
It's actually nice, actually. I like it.
It's overcomplicated, and that's coming from a German.
Going to my home. Good job, Hopkins. Good man. How are you feeling?
A little too tall for these things.
Oh, it's warm out here. What the hell?
That's off.
You should have told me that. Yeah, I know. What the hell? You sweltering.
If you like it.
This is stolen. This is stolen. This is
like
some rat
ratatouille.
Yes, ratatouille. Ratatouille.
Oh, I wanted to do one of these that ends up with a little robe, so it's
Jesus, oh God.
No.
Wow.
I'm gonna hide myself in my mood still.
taxidermy, he died for your skin.
Can I get up?
Oh,
Lord.
Stop. Please.
Oh my God.
That's all I think.
That's all he thinks about.
All the rat jokes you could
It tells us a lot about you, Joe.
Yes, it does.
And we love you, but it tells you a lot. It tells us a lot about you.
I'd say he
what
needs
you
a
think
hobby,
about while
but it
you're
sounds like he's
taxidermy
got
rat.
one. I'd say he needs a hobby, but it sounds like he's got one.
Taxidermy?
Yeah.
No, you're right.
I was going to taxidermy rat. What if I make it Rat Jesus?
So I went to go buy it. I was like, there's just a pile of all these people in the market. And I said, how much is this helmet? And the guy's like, $10 or something. I'm like, okay, there's no liner, it's all beat up. And then he puts it on, and then he goes, Hitler! And I'm like, this is a World... I didn't say it. That's a World War I helmet. Don't you?
Yeah, you finish the skirt. But I forget what pattern it was.
Well, and also this.
So they loaded.
Yeah, that's. I have a cover in there, but really for this early.
Anna's she made that one. I traced that. That's an original that I got in the antique store for like $30.
Cool.
And traced it and then made this one.
Oh God! All right, that's it, George. You're wrong.
Thank you. This is a modern sweater. Yeah, and it has all the details.
It does.
All
Do you
it
know
needs
why
is
they
a
had
belt.
spikes in the helmets?
No.
Don't know. Oh wait, it took you that long to even see it? Oh my God. Oh my God. Get help.
Send
I'll get help, but you also apparently.
Send help.
No, I'm really good at. I have so many things to hold on to.
Okay.
One more thing.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
So we've been eating it out in the field, and this is actually our food. This is what we'll be eating today. There's no props here. The bread is our bread. This is Stolen, which is a Christmas bread. This is brie cheese that we stole, which is not different from stolen, different kind of stolen, from a French farmhouse. We have some French bread. We also have Braunschweiger, which is a liver sausage. Liver and other organ meats aren't as popular today as they are in 20th century Germany, especially. It's a great way to get nutrients, iron and fat into your diet. So liver sausage is another good one. And you know, this is food for about 20 people. So it looks a little sparse for 20 people. But when you consider at Christmas time we have Christmas cookies, which are loaded with sugar and fat, it's a great way to bulk up a little bit when you've had a little bit more deprived diet. And the German army really, really believed in Christmas. They thought it was important, especially in 1914, getting people a little taste of home so they didn't feel quite so miserable in the field. So they did do things, as Dave talked about out there, shipping Christmas trees and food to the front. The British said, these are Princess Mary tins. Every soldier in the British Army got a little tin that would have been filled with tobacco and candies and things that would have made home feel a little bit closer. So Princess Mary tins went to every single British soldier in the British Empire. Different soldiers would have received different food. So the soldiers out of India would have received very different food that felt familiar to them than the soldiers who came out of, say, Lancashire in England or Yorkshire. They're sort of the mainline British soldiers would have always gotten very similar things. But if you were from Canada, or if you were from India, or from China, which were part of the British Empire at the time, you would have had very different food in your tin. But every single British soldier would have had access to a princess.
For birthday, I got Louise a toffee hammer for her.
Come on, Jeff.
If you're looking for him, he's in the middle of an hour-long talk.
I think he just hits replay. See, we didn't even bother shaving for like a week. Just to look steady.
I mean, it's
Yes.
Well, they're also not his boots, they're my boots.
So you were explaining you made your own outfits?
Some of it's original, some of it we made. Yeah. The hat's original, and the skirt's patterned out after original pattern, and the blouse is original. The reproduction boots from Joe Bear. Very good company.
Yeah.
It's highly recommended. Made by your sister. Yes. Yeah, oh yes, this is hand knit, so very handy.
Are you taking pictures or making a movie?
Making a movie.
Then I'll be quiet.
Yeah, well, you can talk up now.
I'll talk. Mink oil. Got mink oil your boots.
Okay, I have some mink oil.
There's some mink.
I mean, this is a party.
Yeah. And then you're a Russian?
I'd probably be hiding in your place.
So did you get dressed up just for us?
Yeah.
You get dressed up just for us, this? Just for us, right? Okay. And I noticed you right away.
We had to represent the women. Usually there are more women than I thought here, but usually usually more as in
Although technically, if she were Russian, she would, at this point in the war, she would have a shaved head for the Women's Death Battalion.
That's right. I read about that. I had a book about the women of World War I. Yes, that was. Did he get that?
I'm working on getting her a Russian telegraph office, which has these. It's a telegraph pole with lightning bolts and a laurel. And a laurel for the insignia and on all of the buttons. So we'll see if we can find one her size.
No, he goes in the middle.
Oh, wow, I'm a lucky man. Wait, my wife is out there, but don't let her see.
Oh, this is the first place this is going. You know, they got dressed up just for us.
Right.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was about to say.
So if you'd like to try a piece of the French cake, you're welcome.
Piccadilly, goodbye, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's still there. That's one of the bedtime repertoire for the kids. Couple.
As off to the barrack we crawl. There'll be no promotion this side of the ocean.
Hazelnut chocolate?
Cheer up, me lads, tough all.
Very yummy.
I had to explain more recently when I sing that what free militia is.
Oh, right.
Because a lot of people have no idea who that is.
That's true.
And that was, I mean, kind of pre my time. Right. It was just kind of disbanded. Probably right around the time I started.
Ron's right, you're so good.
I'm starting my German stuff going. This is good. This is good. You like liver sauce, and even if you don't, try it anyways. Because I mean, it's like
Tommy Atkins. How are you, Tommy Atkins? Right.
What if you're like,
I have.
You're Tommy Atkins.
How nice.
That's a perfect whack.
I know. I got.
That's what the guys would use in the trenches and stuff like that. All right, now I gotta do that. Shit, I thought the cane was
right. It's a whacking stick is better.
It was harms. So just for your count.
Were you out of harm's way?
Yes. Just out of it.
Put up folks. Oh, see, now he's playing with it.
Did you open the package yet?
No, where's the package?
No. This is Bruno Gerlach, and I think it's in the bunker.
Oh, Bruno Gerlach is him?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. What the fuck?
So I have a friend on my Facebook page who's named Bruno Gerlach. He's a distant cousin of mine who still lives in Germany.
I had no idea.
Sometimes there's German comments on my stuff. It's because he speaks primarily German.
Fine, but I could have given you.
I decided
mine?
to become last.
Dave was trying to give us
No, that's fine.
showing up at all. Fucking Dave, because you were fucking paying attention.
Sorry, I have it.
Ich habe Schnaps! Oh, yes! Ich habe mir Schnaps! Es ist sehr ausgezeichnet!
Hey, are you opening that? Because
Amerikanischer Schnaps! Mehr amerikanischer Schnaps!
So what I'm going to do on this
it's all Schnaps.
Und ich habe eine Tannenbahn! Ich habe eine Tannenbahn!
We're going to White with Pumpkins.
Christmas presents?
Pumpkins, we're going to White with.
1,000%! No, I want to make all the little cars. No, do you have enough of these guys? No, I'll do all the tissue paper. And they're like, oh, do you want me to string those? I'm like, yes.
There's some shifts in there.
No, I know how to make twine.
What's your date on it?
I'm not tired.
I don't think there's a date on it.
That's a really, usually
That's a nice one.
that is a really nice
Looks
one.
like Bing, but
I have one in mint condition. It looks like it's a reproduction, so clean. I got it at Elkhorn. And I was shopping with another reenactor. I said, and I just stood there. It's like, are you done in the booth? Like, I am. Are you done in the booth? Like, he saw some. And they went back to the booth 3 times. They went through the booth 3 times. So like, you guys done? Like, yeah. It's like, boom, I walk right over, there's a ladder, and right on the ladder is one of these in mint, absolutely perfect condition. 1916 dated.
nice.
For like $8. I'm like, oh.
Mine's a 1917 Bing. Brother's
Like one
Bake.
thing
Fifi! Fifi!
Is today your birthday? It's close, right?
It's Monday.
That reminds me. Oh,
Yeah, this is the most uninterested I've ever been in a birthday.
give me a splash, but just a splash.
we never
Oh, God damn it! Holy shit! I'm on meds. I can't even drink all that. Was it as good as for you as it was for me? Were you happy with the rats? Did they do a good job?
He did a great job with the rats.
especially with that one.
Really like you before I give them the ball.
I love that. That's great.
I wish I could make.
Right. Now we got some.
Actually, I've been holding on to those for the rats forever to just take pictures, and they keep forgetting I can bring them to the front. You saw the little pile of
Vile little buggers.
Hello, wife. Hello. How are you? Coffee?
I do.
We did have some people that were like.
When you were over, she was reading a book of 3 short stories, and then she's like, Anna, you need to read the last one in here because it's about World War I, and it will wreck you. And I was like, okay. It sounds like my kind. What was it about? It was a female reporter, written in the 30s. Female reporter, and it was a short story, so like very little plot. But just in love with this sweet soldier guy who was American, 1918. He was about to go over, and then she gets thank you.
I got quite a bit put on also.
Oh, she wakes up. This happened. War's over.
Yeah, I know.
She gets letter. He died of influenza. And it's over. And I'm like, thank you. Listen, this is exactly the short story I wanted to read. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
My wife wants to know like 3 weeks or 4 weeks in advance.
Oh, what a fool I am.
So I grabbed my phone to the guy and loaded it up with my rep. And I proceed to do, normal like infantry. Boom, boom, boom. Pull it back 5 rounds like that. Center mass, his girlfriend starts laughing. Oh, pissy.
I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do with my Mosin.
What?
I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do with my Mosin. 1944, it's a sniper variant.
Ooh.
And